Okay, so we're going to talk about civil liberties. So let me get this started. Okay, so civil liberties. If you remember, the Bill of Rights were added in order to give the anti-federalists some sort of reason to vote for the Constitution. It was a promise. It was a political tool that the Federalists used to get the anti-federalists to agree to the Constitution, get it ratified, get it pushed through those 13 states. In it, it has certain protections from the government when you can point to it in the Constitution and it protects you from a big oppressive government. That's the term that we want to use for civil liberties. Civil rights, think of any sort of discrimination. It could be an employer, it could be society in general. So that's the difference between civil liberties and civil rights. Civil liberties are those constitutional, you could point to it on paper, those constitutional protections that you have against the government. They're the first 10 amendments. Remember that they wanted to restrict the national government. Today, it's very different. We've incorporated many of these liberties, and we make the state and local governments abide by them as well. That's what incorporation means. One of the most important of those, well, actually, let me rewind a little bit. When we talk about how it was restricted just to the national government, remember that that was a famous court case, 1833, Barron v. Baltimore. It ruled that the Bill of Rights only restrained the national government, that states and cities were free to still restrict your freedom of speech or your press or any of those kind of things. So it only restricted the national government. Okay, now they're incorporated, and here's how. When we're talking about freedom of religion, remember that there's two clauses that are really important. The first one is going to be the Establishment Clause, that we will not have an official U.S. religion, that there is going to be a wall of separation between the church and state, as Jefferson would say, that no religion can also be prevented. So famous court cases that go along with this are going to be Lemon versus Kurtzman, where the Supreme Court said that if the government gives any sort of aid or money or resources to church-sponsored schools, like a private Catholic school or something like that, that any money that comes from federal tax dollars has to be spent on secular purposes. They cannot advance or promote any sort of religion. They can't be mixed with the religion, so it keeps the money very separate. So that's a big time example. Also, a famous court case would be Engel versus Vitale, that said no school officials could force or mandate students to pray. So this is commonly referred to as the school prayer case. Engel versus Vitale, we see that government, the state, cannot be pro-religion, because if you're pro one denomination of religion, therefore you're anti-other religions, and we can't do that. We cannot have an official religion clause. Okay, and then also in the First Amendment we see free exercise clause. This would infer that you can have any religious beliefs you want, but remember, all of your rights are restricted when they start to infringe upon other people's rights. So if we were to talk about if Amish people didn't want to send their kids to public schools, or if they didn't want to have their kids, have the shots that prevent disease, I can't think of the word right now, but anything like that, or if you want to sacrifice human beings, that's a more drastic example, or you wanted to use hardcore narcotics during your worship service, all of these things also violate other current laws and violate the stability and order of society in general, and so you don't have complete free exercise when practicing your religious beliefs. We have to balance what you believe and your practice of that belief with other people's rights and society's order and stability. So there you go. Some religious practices may conflict with other rights, and then they can be denied. When we're talking about freedom of expression beyond speech, we're also going to mention press. And anytime you talk about censoring the press, stopping a newspaper from publishing something, that's called prior restraint. Government's ability to prevent material from being published beforehand. You might also know this as censorship. Pretty generally, the Supreme Court strikes down prior restraint. When the government tries to censor speech or press, as was the case in Neer versus Minnesota, it's not allowed. The only time that you see an exception to this general idea that prior restraint is forbidden is if a newspaper was trying to write an article about troop movement and how our troops were going to invade a certain city or village in Afghanistan. If the enemy were reading that article and they could supply themselves and build up defenses beforehand, we would be putting our troops in harm's way by publishing that. So often, in these cases, prior restraint is granted. The government can censor or at least delay an article from being published. Okay. Another time that we could limit free speech would be Schneck versus U.S. when we hear the idea that anytime speech is going to present a clear and present danger, then we can limit free speech there. And the common example would be to yell fire in a theater. If you did that, everybody would jump up, they'd run towards the exit, people would get trampled on like it was Black Friday at Walmart. You would be putting people in danger, and if you did that, you could be held criminally negligible in that circumstance and be charged with disorderly conduct or inciting a riot or whatever the charge would be. Free speech would also be limited if it was obscene, which is Miller v. California. Or if it was libel, which, remember, libel looks like library, so it has to be written. Libel is when you write things that are false and malicious, and slander is when it is spoken. So these are examples of times which we limit speech. You do not have the freedom of speech if it is obscene, or if it is libel, or if it is slander. Also, if you're private property, you can always kick people out of your private property, your home or your business, those kinds of things. If it's not public ground, you can have limited speech in those circumstances. So remember to study libel, slander, the differences. You'll also want to study New York Times versus Sullivan, Miller v. California, Schneck versus U.S. The reason these cases are significant because we see speech being limited. Remember, we have a constitutional limit that includes a speedy and public trial. The reason trials are public is to make sure that there's transparency. The public has a right to know what happens. The press own information may not be protected, so reporters and those kinds of details may also be published. So it extends even to the press. Back to obscenity. The hard thing about obscenity is there's not a very clear definition. What was obscene in the 1920s is drastically different than what's obscene today. What's obscene in Sunnyvale, Texas is drastically different than what's obscene in downtown Dallas. So there's a very fuzzy, very slippery slope when we're talking about obscenity. And the famous case is Miller v. California. And here is how Miller v. California, the Supreme Court justices, define obscenity within this case. If a certain work, a book, a novel, a movie, anything like that, magazine, if the whole work appeals to a prurient interest in sex, if the whole thing is about sex, and if it's patently offensive sexual conduct, well, you see again, this is kind of blurry language. What might be offensive to one community might be acceptable to another. And also, if it lacks any other value, literary, artistic, political, scientific, if it lacks any other value, entertainment maybe, then if it lacks all those, and if it's offensive and it's all about sex, then it might be classified as obscenity. But local areas have to make their own decisions about what's acceptable and not. So Miller v. California is a huge punt. It does not get us any closer to a nice, easy, clearly defined definition of obscenity. And remember, if something is obscene, it may be censored. So the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, might fine CBS if Janet Jackson accidentally, quote unquote, exposes her breasts on the Super Bowl. You remember that Super Bowl debacle a couple years ago? Well, the FCC fined CBS, and Janet Jackson, I think, got a slap on the wrist or something for doing that. Okay, we've covered libel and slander, so we're going to skip that. Oh, one thing you do need to understand is you have different standards. If you're a public personality, you're a politician, you're a celebrity, you're famous, it's going to be very difficult for you to win any sort of case regarding libel or slander. So when you think of TMZ or any of these sort of gossip magazines or websites covering celebrities and making up false things and all this kind of stuff, well, that comes with the territory of being a celebrity, of being rich and famous. People are going to write about your private life, and sometimes they're going to be wrong. You don't get to sue for libel or slander. But if you're a private individual, you might be able to prove on these things, but it's still pretty difficult. Okay, symbolic speech. We have the freedom of speech, and that even extends to nonverbal speech. Burning a flag, as in Texas v. Johnson, or wearing an armband. Any sort of symbolic speech like that is protected. Commercial speech, generally it is protected, but it's going to be less so than a symbolic speech or any other type of speech because it has a commercial nature. It's advertising. So it's going to be a little more restricted form of speech. And who would be restricting that? Well, again, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. They regulate the content and nature of radio and television. And if you want to run a station on one of their radio or TV, then you have to comply with the regulations that they make. And you might get a penalty or a fine if you don't. And these kind of regulations include making certain time for children's programming and political candidates, both sides. There's a fairness doctrine. There's a lot of things that we could talk about here. But just know that commercial speech is typically more restricted, more closely watched by the FCC than other types of speeches. You have the right to assemble, again in the First Amendment, right to speech, press, religion, petition, and assembly, meaning that you can come together. And it's generally permissible, but you might need to meet reasonable local standards. And if it's a really unreasonable reason for meeting, like the KKK or the Westboro Baptist Church or something like that, what you typically do is plan it out beforehand. You go get a permit, you get the authority to meet legally, and then you have your rally or your meeting, and you can incite anger and frustration that way. So we have a balance here again. The freedom of assembly versus order in society. And typically this freedom wins more than the order side, especially if you go beforehand and you get a permit to have a parade or a rally or some sort of meeting. Within the right to assemble, we also have the idea that we have the right to associate, to form groups and join associations. And this is where the idea that political parties could come, and the NAACP and these kind of ideas. And that when you're a part of these groups, the government can't ask for a membership list to be turned over. You have the right to privately associate with people that you would like to. Okay, so now we're getting to the good stuff. Some of your defendants' rights, the criminal justice rights and limitations you have against the federal government, and eventually, when we incorporate it, the state and local governments as well. And if a police department or an investigative body, some sort of law enforcement agency, if they fail at following these rules at any point, it usually invalidates a conviction and the person gets to walk no matter how obviously guilty they are. Courts continually rule on what is constitutional and what is not. These rules change. What was illegal search one day might be legal and vice versa. So these are changing rights, and police departments and the public should be kept up with the changes. So let's start with searches and seizures, the Fourth Amendment. If a police officer or law enforcement has probable cause, meaning they are in a situation occurring when the police have reason to believe that a person is committing an offense, they should be arrested. then they can do a search and seizure. If it is done in a way that is not legal, that evidence that they gather will not be used in court. And that's the idea of the exclusionary rule, what we get from Mapp v. Ohio. Okay, the Fifth Amendment, we're talking about self-incrimination. You do not have to be confessing. You cannot be compelled to provide evidence that is going to be used against you in court. So the burden of finding all the proof rests on the police and the prosecutors, not the defendant. And that is fundamentally different than the way it is in a lot of nations. A lot of nations will make you prove you're innocent. Well, you've probably heard in your life that you are innocent until proven guilty in this country. And that is a big difference. It gives you the advantage if you're defending yourself for a crime. Also, we see after 1966 the development of Miranda warnings and the Miranda rights, as you probably know them. It comes from a case called Miranda v. Arizona, where guidelines were set for police questionings. The suspect has to know that they can remain silent, that if they say anything, it could be used against them in the court, that you have the right to an attorney when you're being questioned, and if you can't afford one, they'll give you one. Okay, moving on to the Sixth Amendment. The reason the Sixth Amendment is important is because it ensures your right to counsel in federal courts, right, in the beginning. And this right was not incorporated until fairly recently in the 60s and 70s. And now states must provide lawyers in most criminal cases as well. If it's a traffic offense or something like that, speeding ticket, well, that's not going to happen. They're not going to give you a lawyer for that. But any serious criminal cases, the state must provide lawyers as well. And then this was incorporated, if you remember, from Gideon v. Wainwright. We're moving on. You also have the right to a trial by jury. And also, before we get to the actual trial part, you could have a bargain before you get there between the prosecution, between the government, who's ever trying to throw you in jail, and your lawyers or yourself. You can have a deal struck. Maybe you rat somebody out, or you admit guilt for a lesser penalty. A lot of times, court cases will be solved before they ever go to trial from this plea bargaining idea. The jury is generally 12 people. But it doesn't always have to be unanimous like you see in the movies and TV shows. Okay, and then we get to the eighth penalty, but actually let's back up because we missed something. You also have the Sixth Amendment ensuring the right to a speedy and public trial, and we've talked in class about why those ideas are important. But if you're found guilty after all these things, if you still can't prove your innocence, or if the government does a better job proving your guilt, they still cannot be cruel or unusual in how they deal punishment out to you. And that always brings up this idea of the death penalty. And we see certain cases that overturn death sentence sometimes if there wasn't a jury or if it was arbitrarily applied, or that the death penalty is used in a less serious crime. We save the death penalty for the most extreme of crimes, and the Supreme Court has upheld the acceptability of the death penalty to be given out, but again, only in really extreme circumstances, unless you're in Texas, and then we hand it out and we're proud of it. But it does vary from state to state. It cannot be mandatory. The jury gets the option of giving life in prison as well. So they can do that. The idea of this constitutional amendment is to make sure that punishment is proportional to the crime. It needs to have no excessive fines, no excessive jail time. It needs to fit the crime. The punishment does. So let's keep going. You've heard sometimes that you have the right to privacy, and this has been controversial in the Supreme Court. There is no mention in the Constitution of a right to privacy, but this right is inferred from other rights. For example, no unreasonable searches and seizures, the Fourth Amendment, the Third Amendment, where you don't have to quarter troops. These kind of ideas infer that the government doesn't have the authority to stick their nose into places it doesn't belong. So there's a right to be left alone. There's a right to privacy inferred or implied by some of our other amendments. And this right is going to be used to decide some big-time controversial cases. Cases like Griswold v. Connecticut, where the court found that you have a right to birth control, that the government can't restrict that. That Roe versus Wade, that you have the right and the privacy to not have the state come in and decide whether you're going to get an abortion during the first trimester. These kind of cases are obviously really private material, the subject matter, but the government doesn't have the right to stick their nose in there and tell you how to make these decisions. That's the idea. And it's implied by the Fourth Amendment, among others, and obviously it's very controversial. If you want to talk to some radical right-wing people or radical left-wing people, if you mention these cases, you're going to stir them up very quickly. These are ones that our politicians are still debating today, especially Roe versus Wade, and there's a ton of single-issue voters out there who really only care about these two cases. We've talked about that, so we're going to skip that. We're going to skip any sort of euthanasia questions for now, and let's do a quick summary. Civil liberties and democracy. Why is it important to a democracy? Well, people need to be able to express themselves. If we're going to have a true democracy in which people participate and people vote, then if people are going to be involved in the government, then they got to have the ability to express their voice. Also, in our democracy, the Supreme Court is the final interpreter of your civil liberties, and they're continuing to refine and define the limits of our civil liberties and what they mean to us today, in today's society. But what you see is a constant battle between freedom of the individual and order of the society in general. And this is a balance that we strike, and we have to continue to redefine with each new question and each new generation. Generally, civil liberties help to limit the scope of government, help to push government out of our homes, out of our decisions, and keep their nose out of places it doesn't belong. So that is the end of our civil liberties. Later on tonight, I hope to upload a lecture over Chapter 5. So good luck studying. Thanks for listening.